I stood motionless, my eyes locked on the jagged pieces of glass strewn across the floor. My breathing was quick, shallow. The window had shattered moments before, and I hadn't budged since. The phone still clutched in my hand felt cold, its screen dim, but Lena's final words echoed in my mind, ringing louder than the silence that followed. I can't keep this to myself anymore. Lena's voice had wavered, almost breaking, and then silence. No further explanation. No chance for me to say anything. The call ended abruptly, leaving me alone with the wreckage, both literal and emotional, that had unfolded. The shards of glass reflected the pale light from the street outside, casting fractured patterns on the floor. The chill of the night air drifted in through the open window, a biting reminder of the truth I couldn't escape. Lena, my stylist, my friend for so many years, someone I had thought I knew better than anyone, had just dropped a bombshell. Now I was left to deal with the fallout. This wasn't supposed to happen. It all began so innocently. A simple trip to her small salon, one I had trusted for decades. Lena had always been the same, upbeat, friendly, and excellent at what she did. There was something comforting in the routine of it. It was familiar, safe. But that day had been different. The moment I walked into the salon, I could feel it. The air was too thick, the room too warm. Lena greeted me with her usual smile, but there was something in her eyes that felt off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. We exchanged our usual pleasantries, but her words were slower, more careful than they'd ever been. I remember settling into the chair, feeling the comb glide through my hair as she prepared to cut. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, but the tension between us was palpable. And then, without warning, it happened. She leaned in closer, closer than ever before. I could feel her breath near my neck as she adjusted my head, her fingers lingering just a bit too long at my temples. "You've always been different," she murmured almost to herself. My heart skipped a beat, not because of what she said, but because of the tone in her voice, the weight it carried. It was a sound I hadn't heard in all our years together. Before I could process anything, Lena did something that left me frozen. She kissed me. It was quick, hesitant, and soft, but it happened. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but I hadn't. Her lips brushed against mine, just enough for me to know this wasn't some mistake. It wasn't accidental. It was intentional. I should have stopped it. I should have stood up and left, walked out without a second thought. But I didn't. I stayed there, numb, my mind racing, trying to figure out what had just occurred. And before I could even begin to make sense of it, it was over. She pulled back, her eyes wide with shock, as if she had just done something she couldn't take back. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us stretched on, unbearable. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. But even then, I couldn't move. I shouldn't have. The words hung in the air like the shards of glass at my feet. I convinced myself it was nothing, that it would pass, that everything would go back to normal, back to what it had been before. But the tension had been there for months, simmering beneath the surface of every conversation, every laugh we shared. I didn't realize how close we were to crossing the line until we actually did. I tore my gaze away from the broken window and glanced at the phone in my hand. Her words kept replaying in my head. I can't keep this to myself anymore. What did she mean by that? My stomach tightened. Was she talking about the kiss? Or was there something more? Was she planning to tell someone? My thoughts raced, but all I could see were bad outcomes. I knew Lena had feelings for me. I wasn't blind. I had sensed it for a while, but now I feared everything was spiraling out of control. What had started as one fleeting moment of weakness now had the potential to ruin everything. I wiped my hand across my face, trying to gather myself, but my thoughts scattered like the glass on the floor. I couldn't let this get out. If my wife found out, it would be over. I needed to find a way to make sure that kiss meant nothing. I slipped the phone into my pocket and took a deep breath, trying to push back the panic. Lena had always been emotional, quick to react. Maybe she was just having a bad night, overthinking everything. Maybe by the morning, she'd calm down, and we could pretend it never happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the way things worked. Stuff like this didn't just go away. It festered, grew into something far worse. I had to confront her. I had to know exactly what she meant by her cryptic phone call. There was no other choice. I looked at the broken window one last time, pushing the problem aside for now. Right now, there were bigger issues at hand. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out the door, my mind racing with what was to come. There was no going back. The drive to Lena's salon felt like an eternity, though it was just across town. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the wheel, my mind spinning through every possible way this could all go wrong. I tried to prepare myself, rehearsing what I'd say, but nothing sounded right. Every scenario seemed to end in disaster. When I finally pulled up to the familiar little brick salon, my stomach churned. The neon open sign flickered faintly, casting an eerie light across the empty street. It was late, and the usually busy area was unnervingly quiet. I sat in the car for a moment, watching the light flicker. Everything felt unstable, like it could all crumble. What had once been a routine, predictable part of my life was now fragile. I knew I couldn't stay in the car forever, but the thought of facing her, figuring out what came next, made my chest tighten. I wasn't ready, but I had no choice. I stepped out of the car and pushed open the door. The familiar bell above it chimed, but it wasn't comforting this time. Inside, the salon was empty. The chairs lined up neatly, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling silence. Lena sat behind the counter. She lifted her eyes when I stepped inside, but her expression didn't give anything away. The usual light in her gaze, the one that always appeared when she saw me, was gone, replaced by something colder, more distant. Her dark eyes seemed hollow, drained of the warmth I had always associated with her. We stood there, frozen for a moment, both of us unsure of how to begin. I had mentally rehearsed a dozen different ways to start this conversation, but under the weight of her stare, all of them evaporated. She was the one who broke the silence first. "You came," she said, her voice barely audible, almost as though she were speaking to herself. The simplicity of her words hit me hard, like a punch to the chest. "I had no choice," I replied, moving a little closer. "We need to talk about what happened." She turned away, fiddling with a pen on the counter as if it could somehow distract her from the mess we were standing in. "I know," she whispered. I didn't mean for any of this to get so complicated." I nodded, but inside, I was torn. How had it come to this? A single kiss, something fleeting, something that shouldn't have had any real weight, had somehow ballooned into something far more serious, more dangerous. "I didn't want things to get complicated either," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we need to figure out what this means. Where do we go from here?" For a brief moment, she hesitated. Her movements were deliberate, almost cautious, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she moved around the counter, stopping only a foot or so from me. The space between us felt charged, like the very air was thick with the unsaid, with everything neither of us wanted to confront. "I can't get it out of my head," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. That moment, ever since it happened, it's been all I think about. I felt a tightness in my chest. This was exactly what I had feared. Lena wasn't backing down. She wasn't letting go of this. I could already feel everything spiraling out of control, and I knew I needed to handle this delicately if I had any hope of stopping it from going further. "Lena, we both know it was a mistake," I said, my voice a little firmer now. "I don't want to hurt you, but we can't keep pretending this is anything but that. It's not right." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine, as if she were looking for some kind of reassurance. I could see the conflict there, her emotions in a chaotic tangle. For a moment, I thought she might back off. Maybe she understood, maybe she was ready to let it go. But then, she did something that completely threw me off. She stepped forward, so close now that I could feel the warmth of her body, the soft scent of her perfume. Before I could react, she kissed me again. This time, it wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was urgent, desperate, like she was trying to hold on to something slipping away. I froze. Every part of me screamed at me to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But for a brief moment, I didn't. For just a few seconds, I let myself be swept up in the intensity of it, in the confusion and chaos that had been building between us. Then, the weight of reality hit me like a freight train. I pulled away, my chest heaving, my breath shallow. "Lena, this can't keep happening," I said, my voice trembling now too. She stepped back, her face flushed, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what to do anymore." I took a steadying breath, trying to regain control of the situation, trying to hold it all together. "We need to stop this before it gets worse," I said softly. "It's for the best, for both of us." She nodded, wiping her eyes, but I could see the pain written all over her face. I felt a pang of guilt, deep and suffocating, because no matter what I said, nothing could undo what had just happened. The silence between us stretched on, thick and heavy, and I knew it was time to leave. There was nothing else to say, nothing more to do. I turned toward the door, but just before I could reach it, Lena's voice stopped me. "Please don't hate me." I froze, my hand on the doorknob, and turned back to look at her. "I don't hate you, Lena," I said quietly. I don't know how to fix this." With that, I stepped into the night, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a storm I couldn't escape. The drive home felt like a blur. The engine hummed steadily, but inside, my mind was in chaos. The streets outside were empty, lit only by the dull glow of streetlights. Everything felt distant, out of reach, like I was seeing the world through a fog. But in my mind, there was no fog. I couldn't stop replaying everything that had just happened with Lena. That second kiss. It had affected me more than I had expected. The desperation in her touch, the fear in her eyes, the way she clung to that moment like it was her last hope. Worse still, there had been a moment when I let it happen, when I allowed myself to get pulled back in, even though I knew I shouldn't. The guilt settled over me like a heavy weight, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I gripped the steering wheel harder, as if doing so could stop my thoughts from spiraling even further. But the truth was, it was too late. Things had already gotten out of my control. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. My wife was likely already asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed through my life. I sat there for a few minutes, keys still in the ignition, staring at the faint light coming from our bedroom window. It filled me with a deep, gnawing anxiety. She had no idea. She trusted me. She believed in me, and I had broken that trust in a way I wasn't sure I could ever fix. I finally turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I felt numb, disconnected from everything, as I walked toward the front door. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the weight of everything I had done and everything I hadn't said was pulling me down. I paused for a moment, key in hand, taking a deep breath before unlocking the door. I had to keep it together. I had to figure out what came next, how to move forward without completely destroying everything. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was possible, I knew deep down that nothing could ever be the same again. The door creaked open, and the usual warmth of home rushed at me. But instead of comforting me, it felt like a sharp contrast to the chaos inside me. I moved through the living room quietly, careful not to disturb her, the only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream, everything familiar, but nothing feeling quite right. When I reached the bedroom door, I stopped. She was there, lying on her side, the soft rise and fall of her breathing the only sign that she was asleep. I watched her for a long moment, the weight of guilt pressing on me. How had I let it come to this? How had I let everything fall apart? I slipped into the bathroom, closing the door quietly behind me. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For the first time, I really saw myself. My face looked drawn, exhausted, as though the last few days had aged me. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping it might clear my mind, but it didn't. Nothing could wash away the shame that clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't tell her. I knew that now. There was no way to explain what had happened with Lena without ripping our lives apart. But how much longer could I keep pretending? How much longer could I carry this secret before it consumed me? I turned off the bathroom light and crept back into the bedroom, slipping under the covers beside her. The mattress shifted slightly, and she stirred, rolling over to face me. Her eyes fluttered open, For a moment, I thought she might ask where I had been, but instead, she just smiled sleepily and whispered, "You're home late." "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just had some things to take care of." She nodded, her eyes already closing again, and within seconds, she was asleep. I lay there beside her, staring at the ceiling, the silence between us pressing down on me. My mind raced with everything I hadn't said, everything I was keeping from her. And yet, here she was, trusting me, believing I was still the man she married. I wanted to reach out, hold her, apologize for all the things she didn't know, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The distance between us felt impossible to bridge, even though she was right there, inches away. The next few days were a blur. I went to work, came home, and tried to act like nothing was wrong. But the weight of what had happened with Lena was a constant shadow, following me everywhere. No matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to that night in the salon, to Lena's eyes, to the guilt that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. I avoided her calls and texts, knowing I couldn't face her again, not without making things worse. But even though I pushed her away, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the mess I had made. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat, wondering if it was her. Wondering if she was going to push me further, if she was going to reveal the truth I was so desperately trying to keep hidden. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped between two worlds. Something had to give, but I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to undo the damage I'd already caused. And every day that passed, the space between me and my wife grew. Even though she didn't realize it, the silence was suffocating, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Even though neither of us had said anything, I could feel it. My wife wasn't the type to confront things head-on, but I could sense the shift. She wasn't as chatty in the mornings, and the space between us felt heavier, laden with all the things left unsaid. We still went through the motions, cooking dinner, watching TV together, but it felt like we were just playing a part, acting out some version of our life while the truth loomed beneath the surface. I avoided looking at her for too long, afraid that if I met her eyes, she'd see everything I was hiding. Every time her hand brushed against mine, or when she leaned her head on my shoulder, the guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. She still trusted me, still believed everything was fine, and that made it all worse. How long could I keep up this charade? How long before it all unraveled? Lena hadn't contacted me in days. I wasn't sure if that was a relief or if it meant something worse was coming. The last time we spoke, I had made it clear that we couldn't continue down this path. I knew how tangled her emotions were, how dangerous it was to leave things unresolved. A part of me half expected her to show up at my door, or worse, call my wife. Every time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat. The silence stretched on, and with each passing day, the pressure mounted. My wife didn't ask questions, but I could feel her eyes on me when she thought I wasn't looking. I couldn't tell if I was just being paranoid or if she suspected something, but either way, I knew this couldn't go on. It was a quiet Friday night, just like any other. We sat in the living room, zoning out to one of those shows we used to watch when we just wanted to unwind. She was beside me on the couch, her feet tucked under her, her head resting gently on my shoulder. But in that moment, the familiarity felt like a lie. Even though we were close, the distance between us had grown unbearable. Suddenly, she sat up, breaking the silence. I glanced at her, sensing something was coming, though I had no idea what. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said, her voice soft but steady. There was an edge to her tone, a seriousness that tightened my chest. "Yeah." I tried to keep my voice casual, but my throat was dry. She didn't meet my eyes right away. Instead, her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "Is everything okay with you?" she asked. "You've seemed distracted lately." My stomach dropped. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. I should have known it was coming, should have been prepared. But it still hit me like a freight train. My mind raced, scrambling for the right words. Anything to defuse the situation without revealing the truth. "I've just been tired," I said, forcing a weak smile. "Work's been stressful, you know. Sorry if I've seemed distant." She nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. Her eyes told me she wasn't buying it. Not completely. She was searching for something more. Something I wasn't ready to give. Is that all it is? She pressed, her voice quiet but firm. It feels like there's more going on. You're not yourself lately. The panic rose in my chest. How much did she know? Was this just a hunch? Or had she picked up on something deeper? I couldn't tell, but the way she was looking at me, so concerned yet uncertain, made it clear that I was treading on thin ice. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. I swear it's just work. I've been under a lot of pressure, but I'm handling it. For a moment, I thought she might let it go, but then she spoke again, and her next words sent a chill down my spine. Lena called the other day. I froze. My heart raced in my chest. This was what I hadn't prepared for. Of all the things she could have said, this was the one I wasn't ready to face. My mind went blank, scrambling for something to say. Did she? I managed, my voice sounding strained, even to my own ears. She seemed upset, my wife said, her eyes never leaving mine. She paused for a moment before adding. She said she wanted to talk to you, but she couldn't reach you. The room seemed to close in around me. I had ignored Lena's calls and texts, hoping if I stayed silent long enough, she'd give up. But now she had reached out to my wife. I could feel the walls closing in, and I had no idea how to escape. I tried to play it cool, act like it wasn't a big deal. Yeah, I've been meaning to call her back, I said, forcing casualness into my voice. She's probably just stressed about work. You know how she is. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they wouldn't land. My wife wasn't stupid. She could tell when something was off. I could see the doubt forming in her eyes. She wasn't buying it. Not completely. Are you sure? She asked, her voice quiet but insistent. It just feels like there's something you're not telling me. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to confess, to beg for her forgiveness. But the words were stuck in my throat. All I could do was sit there, silent, while the tension between us thickened with each passing second. I'm sure, I finally said, but even I didn't believe it. She stared at me for a long moment, her gaze searching, trying to read me. I could see the hurt in her eyes, and I knew it wasn't just suspicion. It was the start of something much worse. She didn't press further, but I could feel the distance growing between us, the fracture deepening. The trust was already broken. The rest of the night passed in silence. We didn't speak, didn't touch. The space between us felt like an insurmountable chasm. I could feel everything slipping away, and I had no idea how to stop it. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew things would never be the same. I had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The truth would come out sooner or later, and when it did, everything I had worked so hard to build would come crashing down. The days that followed were heavy with an unbearable weight, a silence that was louder than any argument could have been. My wife didn't bring up Lena again, but I could feel it lingering between us, hanging over everything we said and didn't say. She hadn't asked any more questions, but I could see the weight of her silence. It was like she was waiting for me to crack, for the truth to finally spill out. I started avoiding home. I'd leave early, finding any excuse to stay out longer. Meetings, errands, anything to get away from the oppressive tension that had taken over our house. It felt like we were both holding our breath, waiting for the inevitable to break the surface. When I did return, the air felt wrong. It wasn't just the quiet, but the feeling of something waiting to explode. At work, I couldn't focus on anything. Meetings became a blur, and I'd catch myself staring at the screen, lost in my own guilt. It wasn't just a feeling, it was all-consuming, like a weight pressing down on every part of me. Lena hadn't contacted me since the night I had spoken to Emily, but the damage had been done. The distance I'd tried to create didn't matter. One evening, after another day of pretending everything was normal, I came home to an unsettling quiet. The car was in the driveway, but the lights were off. A wave of unease washed over me as I stepped inside, the stillness almost suffocating. Emily, I called, my voice too loud in the silence. No answer. I moved through the house, checking the living room, the kitchen. She wasn't there. A strange, gnawing sense of dread settled in my chest as I walked toward the bedroom. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. I pushed it open slowly, my heart sinking with each step. There on the bed was an envelope, my name neatly written on the front in Emily's handwriting. Beside it, her wedding ring lay on the pillow. The sight of it was like a punch to the gut. I stood there, frozen, the room closing in around me. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to face what I already knew was coming. But there was no avoiding it. With shaking hands, I picked up the envelope, tearing it open. The letter was short, painfully short. It didn't need to be long. The words were simple, but searing. I know. I've known for a while. I wanted to believe you. I wanted to trust you. But I can't anymore. Whatever happened between you and Lena, it's destroyed us. You destroyed us. I'm leaving. Don't try to find me. I read the words over and over, each one cutting deeper than the last. My chest tightened as I felt the finality of it. She was gone. The woman who had been everything to me was gone. And it was my fault. Every lie, every piece of silence, every time I avoided the truth had led me here. I collapsed onto the bed, my head in my hands, suffocating under the weight of it all. How had I let this happen? How had I allowed one stupid mistake to unravel everything? The guilt hit me like a wave, crushing me, drowning me. I couldn't breathe. And just when I thought I might collapse under the pressure, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know who it was. But something inside me made me check. I pulled the phone from my pocket and saw Lena's name on the screen. My stomach twisted. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the answer button. I shouldn't take the call. Nothing good could come from it. But still, I pressed accept. Hello. My voice sounded raw, barely above a whisper. The silence on the other end stretched for a few seconds, and then I heard her voice, soft, hesitant. It's me. I know. I muttered, swallowing hard. What do you want? I heard about Emily, she said, her words stumbling, as if unsure of herself. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear, I never wanted to come between you two. Her voice cracked with regret, but it did nothing to ease the sting in my chest. If anything, it made it worse. It's too late for that, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. She's gone. Lena. She left me. There was a long silence, the kind that made everything feel like it was falling apart, piece by piece. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, shaky and uneven. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to ruin everything. I leaned back against the headboard, exhausted, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. It wasn't just you, I said quietly. I made my own choices. This mess, it's on me. We sat in silence for a long while, neither of us knowing what to say next. The air between us thickened with everything left unsaid. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to end the conversation, to sever the last connection to the chaos I had created. But I couldn't. Lena, I finally said, my voice almost a whisper. I need to know. Why did you do it? Why couldn't you just let it go? Another pause. And then her voice, barely audible, came through the phone. Because I loved you. Those words struck me like a blow to the chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Love me? That wasn't supposed to be part of this. That wasn't the way things were supposed to unfold. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I was too stunned, too lost to know what to say. What could I say to make sense of all this? Then, before I could gather my thoughts, she said something that froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. There's something you don't know, she whispered. Something I've been meaning to tell you. And I don't think I can keep it a secret anymore. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my mind racing. What could she possibly mean? What was it that she hadn't told me? And why did it feel like whatever was coming next would be worse than everything else?